The leadership of Russian President Vladimir Putin is today hanging by a thread, following a swift but powerful coup by the rebel Wagner military group, which Sky News All-Stars Andrew Boltz, Rowan and Peta Credlin say has made Putin a dead man walking. But is everything really as it seems on the surface? Sky News host Peter Stefanovic says Putin may just be orchestrating the whole thing, as always, for his own gain.
This is treason, and it is about the ambition of inimical forces.
We embarked on a march of justice on June 23. In 24 hours, we got to within 200 kilometres of Moscow. In this time, we did not spill a single drop of our fighters' blood. Now the moment has come when our blood could be spilled. Understanding responsibility for the chance that Russian blood will be spilled on one side, we are turning our columns around and going back to field camps as planned.
Australian Strategic Policy Institute senior analyst Malcolm Davis explains what happened during the sudden military coup.
Well, some confusion. Saturday morning we started with Prigozhin launching this insurrection and a march up towards Rostov-on-Don, which he took with relative ease, and then moved on to Voronezh, which was the next town along that highway, with Moscow being the next city after that. And so everyone was watching how quickly this was moving, the fact that the Russian government weren't really able to stop this, and the concern was that this insurrection would turn into either a civil war or some sort of coup against the Putin regime. And certainly by the end of Saturday, as I headed to bed, that's what all the indications would happen. Sunday morning I wake up and it's all over. Prigozhin has essentially taken a deal. He goes to Belarus. Wagner essentially goes under the control of the Russian military, and we seem to have averted the civil war. But I don't think that's the end of the story. I think it's just the beginning of the end of the Putin regime. I think we have to watch now what happens to Putin's power base as a result of this insurrection happening on his territory.
But the rebellion was short-lived, and Sky News host Andrew Boltz says a truce was reached between Putin and Prigozhin because both of them had weaknesses.
And on Sunday morning, Putin went on national TV and promised terrible revenge on these mutineers.
This is treason in the face of those who are fighting on the front. This is a stab in the back of our troops and the people of Russia. These people who are responsible will certainly be brought to justice on behalf of our people, and the punishment for this monstrous activity will be very harsh.
Empty words. Putin isn't punishing them at all because he's too weak, he can't do it. Because just 4 hours after he said that, we're going to punish these people, he actually made a deal with Prigozhin, with the help of his friend, the president of Belarus. The deal? Prigozhin called off this revolt and went into exile in Belarus. He could take his soldiers there too. He and his soldiers would not be punished. Prigozhin agreed, and he left Rostov-on-Don to the cheers and the applause of locals there, which is yet another sign of Putin's weakness.
Yevgeny Prigozhin, presumably en route to Belarus, waved off to cheers in Rostov last night.
Now, Prigozhin agreed to this deal, I'm guessing, because not enough Russian troops had defected to his side. On the other hand, very few had resisted his march on Moscow either. So how gutless is Putin? Because while soldiers scrambled in Moscow to defend him and his regime, Putin's private plane on Saturday was actually tracked leaving the capital to fly towards St. Petersburg. And Putin hasn't been seen since, not in public.
Sky News host Peta Credlin agrees, saying the truce seems fishy.
The apparent coup then fizzled out, almost as mysteriously as it began, with Prigozhin reportedly freed of treason charges and taking refuge with Putin ally, the Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko. And the mutinous Wagner soldiers, likewise, supposedly forgiven and supposedly now being reintegrated into the Russian army. Now, given Putin's record of killing opponents, it's hard to see that this is the end of the matter. Here is the former US intelligence chief James Clapper, who is as suspicious as I am.
Maybe I spent too much time in intelligence, but this whole thing, this deal to me is kind of fishy. That all of a sudden, Prigozhin stopped, turned left or turned back, and then he's going to agree to go of all places, Belarus, which is essentially, from a security standpoint, an extension of Russia. This is an unanswered question, obviously, and hopefully as we learn more, we'll find out just what happened. But on its face, it's a little fishy to me.
Putin has maintained his tough rhetoric against the rebel fighters, saying they will be brought to justice.
These people who are responsible will certainly be brought to justice on behalf of our people. The armed forces and other force agencies have received instructions, and restrictive measures have been taken in Moscow region, and lots of other regions.
I'm just sort of knocked over by President Putin's response. You know, the classic lines: "You've stabbed me in the back, and nobody will be unpunished." This is straight out of Stalin's playbook, as a matter of fact, and he's taking it very seriously.
But Sky News host Peter Stefanovic thinks there's more going on beneath the surface, and nothing is quite as it seems.
But Putin is not stupid. The ex-KGB strongman has seen it all and dodged it all. All I'd say is to be very cautious when writing any obituary about him. He's as dangerous as he's ever been, and if he is in trouble, then that just makes him even more dangerous. As the BBC reports, Daniel Treisman, a professor of political science at the University of California, wrote last year, the system created by Putin contains so-called tripwires to prevent a coup, noting that officials with armed men at their command lack the mutual trust to organise a conspiracy. In this regime, Mr. Shoigu is kept in check by Wagner, while the mercenaries remain cowed by the military. At the top of the pyramid sits Mr. Putin, the chess master, moving pieces around the board and maintaining balance in the system. Also, something else to dwell on, Russia's next presidential elections are scheduled for March next year. Might Vladimir Putin want to show he's the country's protector-in-chief by fending off a perceived uprising from within, while also lure Ukraine into a false sense of security? In Russia, nothing is ever as it seems.
Military lawyer and defence academic Dr. Glenn Kolometz also doesn't accept the status quo that Putin is weak and has given up.
Janie, this was, and we have to look at Russian history here. This was classic Russian Maskirovka, deception operation by both Putin and Prigozhin. This is Putin sending a message via Prigozhin to the Shoigu-aligned factions in the Kremlin, and it's Prigozhin sending a message that he wants Shoigu and Gerasimov removed from office. So there's a bit of a power play happening here. And as I said yesterday, Putin and Prigozhin are pretty close in a whole bunch of areas. And look, I just think there's more to come in that space. We're even seeing Prigozhin now speaking against the operation in Ukraine, and I suspect we'll see Putin speaking along those lines too, but he needs somebody to blame.
The mainstream media disagrees and sees this coup as the final straw that tops off a turbulent few years for the increasingly physically and mentally weak president.
You would think that, what we almost saw here, a coup by Prigozhin and the Wagner group, which is even more brutal and vicious, would be not a great replacement for Putin. What comes after Putin, however he winds up going? And I mean, surely whatever comes next is going to be worse for the West than, and I don't see any sort of liberal democratic movement, I guess, that's going to come in and take over.
No, I agree with you entirely. I think if if Prigozhin had managed to install himself in the Kremlin, that would have probably been a worse thing than even Putin. Though it's hard to imagine what could be much worse. But I think the other contenders potential contenders that we know about in Moscow to take over from Putin are no better than him. And I think those people who think bring down Putin and everything will be great, I think that's far from the reality. And if had this coup sort of unfolded further, I think it's very unlikely to have been a clean break and a changeover of command, so to speak, of Russia. I think we would have seen some pretty bad fighting across the country and maybe the breakup of Russia. And that could happen, if this has indeed sowed the seeds of instability in Russia, we could see a very bad situation for the Russian people. That doesn't necessarily mean it'd be bad for the West or for the world as a whole, but it would, I think, be quite bad for Russia and Russia's stability.
He's going to be very focused on re-establishing himself as a strongman, in particular because he's very aware that Beijing is watching. And if Putin does not reassert himself, then Beijing will lose confidence in him and he could then suffer essentially a loss of support from China. So the first thing he'll do will be to undertake a purge of his national security officials, his key supporters, to make sure that anyone who was seen to support Prigozhin is removed quite swiftly. Second thing that he will do probably is ramp up the nationalist language that he's using in regards to the war in Ukraine. He says he pushes this false narrative that this is some sort of war between Russia and NATO. He could strengthen that narrative and try and become more provocative along NATO's eastern frontier and in the south. The third thing he'll do, I think, is rattle nuclear sabers. He just recently deployed nuclear weapons into Belarus. He could start talking once again about how he might use nuclear weapons and threats of nuclear weapons use against NATO. So he'll be doing everything he can to reassert his image as a strongman. He will certainly be seeking to remove anyone that challenges him, and he will certainly be seeking to enhance his image as a strong leader in the war in Ukraine.
And what about Ukraine? The war continues to rage right on Russia's doorstep, and this latest uprising could mean the underdogs benefit once again.
This recent event has probably played into Ukraine's advantage because the Russian forces are already demoralized. Prigozhin has quite a lot of respect among rank-and-file Russian troops. They see him as on their side. And he came out, one of his statements he came out with was that the entire war is based on a lie, and that there wasn't a threat to Russia from Ukraine. There was no need to denazify Ukraine, and there wasn't a threat from NATO, all of which we know to be true. But I think, the spreading of the dissatisfaction and maybe further undermining the morale of the Russian forces already in pretty bad state, I think probably works to Ukraine's benefit, maybe not in the immediate term, but in the longer term.
The West has been considered in their response to the latest upheaval in Russia, knowing that information is scarce and the situation is delicate. Sky News host Andrew Boltz highlights the unusual silence of Donald Trump.
So what does Trump and the far right, what does this do to them? How can they now be urging, oh, look, we've got to cut off aid to Ukraine? How can they say that now? How can they keep saying, oh, Putin is too strong, this war's going to last forever, it's all a terrible mistake, not America's business, get out. Really? How can they do that? Because what we saw on the weekend says the opposite. Putin is weak. It says Ukraine can win this war. I mean, Prigozhin sure thinks so. So can Donald Trump seriously now call for an end to military aid in Ukraine? Can even flirt like he did a few weeks ago with the concept, I might do too much aid. Can he do any of this when Putin's campaign and his power are visibly crumbling in front of our eyes? He can't do it. If Trump kept saying that, kept playing footsies with the, pull out of Ukraine now, it looked like he was bailing out a dangerous dictator in Putin, who's actually losing even the respect of his own soldiers and his people. And an act like that of bastardry to Ukraine, of weakness, of lack of consistency, of American fickleness that would be unforgivable. What do you think China would make of that? It's unforgivable because Ukraine is in fact the first battle of a new World War III. If Russia wins in Ukraine, who will it attack next? China, Putin's big ally here, it's been watching to see if the West would give up on defending Ukraine, because that would then give China the green light to invade Taiwan. The West's too weak to resist, it would conclude. So no, Putin's clearly a dead man walking. Trump must, and I think will now see it's impossible to help Putin by cutting military aid to Ukraine. And besides, doesn't Donald Trump hate losers? And right now, Vladimir Putin is the greatest loser of all. That coward, which is so good to see.
But Sky News host Corey Bernardi disagrees, saying the West is purposely inciting conflict in the region to push their own agenda.
I've got to say there is something odd about this aborted Russian coup that took place over the weekend. It comes after more than $6 billion was unaccounted for by the Pentagon after allegedly being sent to the Ukraine. Now, it's not beyond the realm of belief that the money was actually used to support the rebellion against Putin, but we don't know that for sure. I have said all along, the goal of this Ukraine proxy war is actually regime change. First, they want to change Putin out of Russia, and then they want to get rid of Xi in China. The Americans have said as much, and they quite frankly don't care how it comes about. The problem with that agenda is that in terms of alternatives, Putin is actually a reasonable and considered moderate. Those who would be likely to replace him would be a much greater threat to global peace than he is. And this latest move, whether it's inspired and funded by the US or not, will likely see an escalation in the Ukraine war. To my mind, Putin will now have to solidify his leadership by appeasing the hardliners in his ranks. Now, in doing so, it's a high-stakes game, but he'll be playing into the hands of the United States, who I believe are itching to formally engage through NATO with the Russians. Now, we're entitled to ask, why is it that the Western world is cheering on escalation in this regional conflict? They've repeatedly shut down opportunities for resolutions. And one can only guess the motivation is the same as every other war: money, power, resources. And in the case of the US, a war could serve as a convenient, if deadly, distraction from the corruption and dysfunction of their ruling political elite.
Sky News contributor Joe Syracuse agrees, saying the West is itching to take full advantage of this opportunity.
You know, there is a reason why the atomic clock is 90 seconds to midnight. And there'll be people in the West, and I'm talking about the Poles and the Boltz and the others, who are dying to get into Ukraine with ground troops, dying to put in those F-16s, and they're dying to bring Ukraine into NATO. They're going to say that this is our moment. There's probably a 48, 72-hour window. Keep in mind, you know, look at America. They had a Chinese balloon over America, and the leadership melted. I mean, Putin's either going to be stronger when this is over, or he's going to be gone from the scene. But I believe that in the West, there'll be enormous pressure to take advantage of this opening. And I think this is, I've seen this, of course, at the end of the Cold War. We had tanks in Moscow and came out in Boris Yeltsin's favor. But these are very serious players.
Sky News host Peta Credlin says the West needs to remember that Putin is a cornered animal with access to nuclear weapons. And if he decides to lash out, it could spell disaster for all of us.
But before any of us cheer this latest setback for a genocidal dictator, remember that cornered animals are often at their most dangerous. Dictators who lose usually die, and a weakened Putin may be more inclined to lash out using his one trump card, and that is of nuclear weapons.